In the southern part of Japan, you can find something strange on satellite images. Here is the city of Nagasaki, and right nearby there are a couple of small islands. Some of them are empty, some house beach resorts, but then there's this island, densely packed with destroyed ruins of a former city. Google Street View works here. You can drop a pin, walk around, and explore the empty streets and abandoned buildings. It looks eerie. And it's plain to see that this island has been abandoned for quite some time. But yet, even with nothing left but ruins here, this tiny piece of land has a big story to tell. One that is much larger than recent Japanese history. It stands as a chronicle of global conflict, the rise and fall of an empire, and this island is the cause of a conflict that is still ongoing even today. This is Hashima. What drew me to this topic initially is that, in many ways, the story of this island directly mirrors the story of Japan as a nation. In the late 1800s, Japan experienced an industrial revolution that fundamentally transformed the country. Japan moved from being a nation rooted in agriculture to become a major industrial power. Railroads were constructed, factories sprung up, shipyards were established, and all this change required energy, which led to the establishment of new mines across the country, including on Hashima. Coal was discovered down in the seabed beneath this rugged island in the 1800s, and the rapidly growing Mitsubishi Corporation caught wind of this discovery and bought the entire island to mine the coal to use as fuel for its expanding fleet of steamships. And just as coal mining on the island was booming, coal production in all of Japan was breaking records. In 1874, Japan extracted 208,000 tons of coal. By 1890, this figure had surged to 3 million tons. And by 1919, it had reached 31 million tons. As the mine continued to grow into the early 1900s, the need for more workers and more space increased. Therefore, Mitsubishi started to expand the size of the island, using the slag produced from the coal mine to artificially widen the island. In order to protect the more fragile flat land that was reclaimed, a concrete wall was constructed around the island to protect it from the violent waves and typhoons that would crash against it. This new space would be mostly used for mining facilities, with living space dedicated to the rocky north on original island soil. And just like the island was expanding, the Japanese Empire as a whole was also expanding its territorial control. Driven by the desire to secure resources and influence, Japan occupied part of the Sakhalin Island, as well as Korea, imposing its rule on local populations. Meanwhile, on Hashima, space was used as effectively as possible. Rather than to dedicate any precious land for farming, food and fresh water were instead shipped in from mainland Japan. This way, every inch of the island that wasn't used for mining could instead be used to build more housing structures and to build supporting facilities for miners and their families, such as a school, hospital, shops, and a movie theater. They even built a pachinko parlor, which is a place where workers can go and gamble. As Hashima continued expanding, adding more artificial land and springing up more concrete structures, it began to take on its characteristic shape. When viewed from land, the island would appear like a large gray ship. And people began referring to the island as Gunkanjima, literally meaning Battleship Island. And in the 1930s, as the island increasingly resembled a battleship, more and more real warships began to navigate the seas around it. That is because during the same time, Japan found itself embroiled in several conflicts, most significantly with the Republic of China. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, and in 1937, a full-scale invasion of China began, sparking the Second Sino-Japanese War. With Japan aiming to expand its empire even further, this conflict would later become part of the larger Second World War. The demand for coal was at an all-time high during this period, and Hashima reached its peak production in 1941, churning out 410,000 tons of coal in that year. And Mitsubishi, the company operating the Hashima mine, was also producing the warships that the coal was used for, as well as aircraft and other weaponry for the war. With an ever-expanding island, the ever-expanding empire gained massive control in Asia, an expansion that came at a massive cost, as Japan forcibly occupied territories across the region, imposing its rule and exploiting resources. A story to which we all know how it ends. On August 6, 1945, Hiroshima was the target of the first atomic bombing. 3 days later, a second bomb would be dropped, the target, the city of Nagasaki, right near Hashima. In the aftermath of the bomb, it was workers from Hashima that were ferried to the scene to help clean up the rubble. And once again, the island of Hashima was deeply tied to the events that would shape Japanese history. Just 4 days later, Japan surrendered. Ironically, just as coal from mines like Hashima was used to fuel Japan's war efforts, it would also help fuel the nation's recovery after Japan's defeat at the end of World War II. In a short time, Japan went from a rival to a strategic ally for the United States, acting as an operating base and source of cheap goods leading into the Korean War in 1950. All industries, including coal, saw a huge economic rise during this time, and Hashima once more began to bring prosperity to Japan. With this continued rising demand for coal came the increasing demand for even more workers. And by 1959, Hashima reached its height in population, with 5,259 people crammed into its extremely tight living quarters, making it the most densely populated place in Japanese history at the time. And yet, coal is a limited resource. By the 1970s, the mine on Hashima began to tap out, and at around the same time, petroleum began replacing coal as the de facto fuel source. In response, Mitsubishi announced in January of 1974 that it would be closing the mine, and all residents and workers would need to leave in just 3 months, with the last boat taking away Hashima's remaining inhabitants in April of 1974. From then on, Hashima remained closed, with entry forbidden for decades. Mitsubishi still owned the land, but had no incentive to upkeep any of the structures, and so they began to crumble and decay. What was once a bustling community became a ghost town, which itself began to attract attention from thrill seekers and the dark tourism community. Despite being off-limits, adventurers would find ways to get to the island, exploring the buildings as they were falling apart. But then, in 2009, the Japanese government changed course and decided to open the island back up for tourists. Officially sanctioned tourist groups would be allowed to step on the island. For this purpose, a new docking area and fortified walkways were installed on the southern part of the island. Here, tourist boats can dock and be shown around the island, and the island would yet again contribute to the Japanese economy, now as a place for tourism. To coincide with the official reopening of Hashima, and perhaps to encourage more visitors to this destination, Japan put forward a request to have Hashima inscribed as a World Heritage Site, a UNESCO title that would bring legal protection to the site as a recognized landmark. Everything seemed to be in order for the proposal, and the request was submitted to UNESCO for review. But then, before anything could be finalized, an outpouring of resistance came from South Korea, North Korea, and China, who all opposed the proposal. But why would they care so much about a tiny Japanese island that was once used for coal mining? The answer lies in the true history of Hashima, the version that Japan has continually attempted to deny and cover up. Because while the story we told so far was correct, it also was incomplete. Because in reality, Hashima wasn't just a coal mine. It was essentially a prison. As Japan expanded its empire throughout Asia, it wasn't just the demand for coal that had increased, but also the demand for soldiers. Japanese and Korean men were drafted into the Imperial Army, leaving a large gap in the industrial workforces. And to fill this gap, men and boys from Korea were forcibly conscribed to work, including for companies like Mitsubishi. And as Japan continued conquering China, Chinese prisoners of war were also used for forced labor at many industrial postings, including Hashima. Conditions for these forced laborers were extremely harsh, and one of the survivors of Hashima, Su Jung-woo, described what it was like for those conscribed. Jung-woo was forced out of his village when he was only 14 years old, as a boat took him closer to Hashima and he saw the concrete seawall meant to protect the island. To him, it looked more like a prison wall meant to keep those captured locked within. He was put in one of the small apartment units with 6 or 7 other forced laborers. Working inside the mine was brutal, with temperatures reaching up to 37 degrees Celsius, mixed with high humidity. Space was extremely limited down below, just as it was on the surface, meaning workers had to crouch and crawl for much of their 12-hour shifts. And accidents were very common, as with limited safety standards, rock slides threatened to crush the workers every day. And while Jung-woo survived his ordeal on Hashima, many of the hundreds of Korean and Chinese prisoners did not. And it is this darker past of the island that the Japanese government is obscuring until today. Many survivors claim that those who perished during their captivity on the island were taken to the nearby island Nakanoshima. Here, their remains would be cremated, sending columns of black smoke into the sky that could be seen from Hashima, giving a bleak reminder of the fate that could be awaiting those who remained. Though this information is, to this day, disputed, as Japan has denied the existence of a crematorium on the neighboring island. The application for a World Heritage Site would take years. And after lots of back and forth, a breakthrough came in 2015 after Japan struck a deal with South Korea. And part of the deal was that Japan would display information about the forced labor history at Hashima Island visible for all the tourists visiting. With South Korea's support, Hashima was officially designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But almost immediately, the Japanese government walked back the promise. A controversial statement was released that claimed that the Korean and Chinese workers were legally drafted for work, just as Japanese men were also drafted for military service. Only in 2023, after facing severe backlash, some small steps were taken to provide additional context. At the Industrial Heritage Information Center in Japan, a small exhibit on Hashima includes a QR code that can be scanned, bringing up a video of the 2015 UNESCO committee discussion, where a Japanese ambassador made a statement regarding the acknowledgement of forced labor at locations such as Hashima. However, the statements made in the video are in English, with no Japanese subtitles. To this day, the question of how Hashima will be remembered remains contentious. Even though relations between South Korea and Japan are stable considering the bloody past, locations like Hashima show that not all wounds are completely healed. To me, the island is a fascinating example of how we think about the past. When we talk about history, it is often at a grand scale. Maps of expanding empires, shifts in power, wars waged and won. But that view can make us forget how deeply history is woven into the places we inhabit every day. Hashima is a great reminder that history isn't just a story of nations and movements. It's the story embedded in every place we stand. A reminder that the local and the global are not separate, that they are intertwined, each telling the story of the other.